Hey guys, tonight we begin with something very relatable: sleep, or more accurately the lack of it, and how even queens were not immune to the slow erosion of their bodies by time and fate. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Now let us drift back to the final winter of Elizabeth Tudor, the woman who had ruled England for nearly half a century, a queen who wore pearls like armor, and spoke with the fire of a monarch certain she had been chosen by destiny. And yet, in the early months of 1603, this iron-willed queen found herself worn down by the same quiet enemies that wait for us all: age, despair, and perhaps a hidden illness that no physician of the time could ever name. The story of Elizabeth's death is wrapped in mystery, not because it was sudden, but because it was drawn out, like the slow extinguishing of a candle in a drafty room. Her ladies reported that she sat upon the cushions in her chamber, unable to lie down, for to lie down was to admit surrender. She stood for hours, leaning against the wall, pale as parchment, her long fingers draped in jewels. She refused food, she refused rest, she refused even to speak of her suffering, and yet her courtiers saw the once blazing queen reduced to silence. What killed Elizabeth is a question that still fascinates historians. Some point to pneumonia, the cold damp English air creeping through the stone corridors of Richmond Palace. Others whisper of blood poisoning, perhaps from the heavy white lead makeup she wore, that ghostly mask of youth slowly seeping poison into her veins. And some even say depression, that peculiar malady of the soul. For she had lost so many in her life: her dear friend and rumored love Robert Dudley, gone; her cousins, executed; her enemies, dead; her throne secure, but her heart increasingly hollow. Real-life examples remind us how fragile even the mighty are. Lead poisoning, for instance, was not rare. Nobles who used cosmetics rich in mercury or lead often suffered tremors, blackened teeth, and sudden declines in health. We see it in the case of Maria Coventry, Countess of Coventry, in the 18th century, who died young after using similar lead-based powders and paints. The very masks of beauty that made women admired in their time were quietly working as assassins on their bodies. Elizabeth was not exempt from such ironies. And then there was her grief. Grief is not merely an emotion, it is a physical weight. By the end of her reign Elizabeth was nearly 70, her body carrying decades of political strain and personal loss. One might think of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who after years of rule retired to a monastery, and wasted away, his body crumbling under the weight of stress. Or of Mary Queen of Scots, Elizabeth's cousin, who wasted 20 years in prison until the axe fell, grief and confinement breaking her long before steel ever did. Elizabeth sat silent in her chambers, staring at the shadows. She refused to go to bed, and when her council begged her to rest, she replied she would have no more of it. She wished only to sit and stare at nothing. This eerie behavior has led some to suspect melancholia, what we might today call clinical depression. There is a haunting echo of this in the final days of Abraham Lincoln, who after losing his son would fall into long spells of silence, staring into space, unreachable by those around him. Even rulers can collapse inward when grief hollows them out. But let us return to the room at Richmond, the ladies watching their queen slowly dissolve into the dusk. She wore her coronation ring so long, that when surgeons finally removed it, her flesh had grown around it, leaving a wound, symbolic perhaps of the price of rule. She had once been called the Virgin Queen, the eternal monarch, but now her body betrayed her. Historians tell us she died on March 24, 1603, quietly in her sleep, after refusing food, water, and medicine for days. Some say she starved herself, others that her body simply collapsed. But in either case, her death came not with drama, but with a sigh. And with her death, the Tudor dynasty ended, slipping into silence, like the extinguishing of a candle. A life begun with fire, ended in quiet shadows. And from her ashes rose the Stuart kings, with James VI of Scotland becoming James I of England, the first monarch to rule both crowns. It is strange how the death of one woman could close an age, and open another, the Elizabethan Golden Age melting into Jacobean twilight, history moving forward, because one frail body could no longer bear its crown. What fascinates us still is not simply that she died, but how she chose to die. Elizabeth resisted death as long as she could, but when it came, she embraced silence. She chose no bed, no speeches, no final declarations, just the stillness of a queen fading into shadow. It is a reminder that even the most powerful among us meet the same end. No courtier can defend you from age, no crown can protect you from grief, no pearl necklace can guard your heart from breaking. So when you close your eyes tonight, think of Elizabeth Tudor, the queen who commanded empires, yet could not command her own flesh. Think of how history is written not only in battles and laws, but in the quiet chambers where rulers sat waiting for death. Think of how the world moves on, not with thunder, but with silence. The Tudors ended not with a war or a rebellion, but with a weary queen staring at the wall, and whispering nothing. And so tonight, as you drift toward sleep, remember that history is not so distant. It breathes, it aches, it falters, it ends. We are all a little like Elizabeth in her last days, wrapped in silence, watching shadows, hoping for rest, that final rest, that unites queen and peasant alike. To understand Elizabeth's death, we have to understand her life, because no end comes out of nowhere. It is the slow result of years of strain, decisions, and sacrifices, all building quietly in the body. Elizabeth became queen in 1558, at just 25 years old. A young woman with fiery hair, sharp wit, and a throne inherited in the chaos of blood and betrayal. Her sister Mary had burned Protestants at the stake. Her father Henry had split the church in half. Her mother Anne Boleyn had lost her head. When Elizabeth took the crown, she carried not only jewels, but the ghosts of her family. It is said she once remarked, "Though the sex to which I belong is considered weak, you will nevertheless find me a rock that bends to no wind," a bold claim, and in many ways, true. She fought off Spain, outmaneuvered nobles, and survived assassination plots, again and again. But a rock under constant wind does not stay whole forever. Cracks form, slowly, invisibly. Think of rulers like Catherine de' Medici in France, who spent decades balancing wars of religion. Outwardly strong, inwardly eroded by grief as her sons died one by one. Or Frederick the Great of Prussia, who commanded armies with brilliance, but collapsed into insomnia and melancholy when the battles were done. Power sustains, but it also consumes. For Elizabeth, the mask of youth became essential. Portraits painted her skin smooth, her eyes bright, her hair golden. But behind the canvas, time moved on. She powdered her face with ceruse, that toxic lead mixture, layer after layer, year after year. It gave her the glow of eternal youth on the surface, while quietly seeding poison in her veins. And then, there was the loneliness. She never married. Not because suitors didn't come, they did, from France, from Spain, from her own court. But she chose none. Some say it was strategy, keeping her throne free from foreign influence. Others whisper it was heartbreak. After Robert Dudley, the man she loved, became impossible to marry. Whatever the reason, it left her alone at the end. Loneliness does not kill quickly. It gnaws slowly. You see it too in Philip II of Spain, her rival, who ruled over the world's greatest empire, yet died almost friendless, his body rotting with gout, his court hushed by silence. Crowns are heavy, not only of gold, but of isolation. Elizabeth's crown weighed more than most. It demanded she play a role, the eternal virgin, the flawless monarch, the queen who never faltered. And so she smiled when her teeth ached, she danced when her bones stiffened, she spoke boldly when her voice grew weak. All of England needed her to be more than human. But in her final years, the strain showed. The mask of white lead makeup could no longer conceal the tremor in her hands, or the fading fire in her eyes. Her counselors worried. Her servants whispered. The people who once saw her as ageless began to wonder, had time finally caught their queen? History is full of rulers who tried to resist age. Augustus Caesar filled his home with young companions to remind him of vitality. Louis XIV of France covered his baldness with a glorious wig, pretending still to be the radiant Sun King. But time humbles all kings, all queens, and for Elizabeth, the truth of her frailty was a shadow she could no longer ignore. So by the time 1603 arrived, her body was already carrying decades of exhaustion, grief, and perhaps the slow poison of her cosmetics. The end was not sudden, it was the sum of everything she had carried. And that is the haunting lesson of her crown. A crown shines brightly in portraits and ceremonies, but it presses down heavily in silence, in solitude, in the long nights where sleep does not come. In her later years, Elizabeth lived not in a palace, but in a theater, though the stage was Whitehall, and the audience, her entire kingdom. Every appearance was carefully constructed. The heavy gowns stitched with pearls, the wigs of flame red hair, the jewels that glittered under candlelight. Her courtiers would kneel, bow, and rise with rehearsed reverence, as if seeing not a woman of 60, but an icon of eternity. But the closer you look, the more fragile the theater becomes. Her famous portraits, the Rainbow Portrait, the Armada Portrait, show her ageless, radiant, almost divine. Her face smooth as ivory, her eyes bright as dawn. Yet these were not mirrors, they were propaganda. Paint could erase wrinkles. Brushes could banish fatigue. The truth, hidden beneath the paint, was harsher. Her teeth had blackened and fallen, the result of too much sugar, the luxury of royalty. She stuffed rags in her mouth to fill the gaps, to keep her speech clear. Imagine delivering a royal address while hiding decay behind cloth. Her hair had thinned, so wigs became essential. Fiery, golden, and impossibly thick, each wig a declaration that time had not touched her. Beneath them, her scalp told a different story. And then there was the makeup. White lead and vinegar, mixed to form the deadly paste called ceruse. Layered thickly, day after day, until her skin could no longer breathe. It was poison disguised as youth. She wore it because her people expected her to look untouchable. She wore it because age was unacceptable in a queen who had sworn herself as the eternal, virgin goddess. This obsession with immortality was not uniquely hers. Take Louis XI of France, who stuffed himself with holy relics, convinced they would extend his life. Or Rudolph II, Holy Roman Emperor, who surrounded himself with alchemists, demanding they find the philosopher's stone. Rulers feared age because it stripped away the illusion of power. Elizabeth feared it too, though she never admitted it. Her counselors noticed. They whispered that she grew irritable when courtiers mentioned the passage of time. She banned mirrors from her chambers, as if reflection itself had become treason. But denial has a cost. When you pretend to be immortal, you deny yourself the human comfort of preparing for death. Instead of soft acceptance, Elizabeth faced her last years in restless defiance. Sleep escaped her. Food no longer pleased her. She paced, night after night, unable to lie down, unable to close her eyes, as though to rest would be to surrender. There is something tragic in that image. A queen surrounded by wealth, by servants, by power, yet unable to do what even the poorest peasant can, simply close her eyes and sleep. And here lies the paradox. The theater of immortality gave England stability. The image of a radiant queen reassured her people through war, famine, and religious division. But the theater also trapped her. She could never step off stage, never remove the costume, never admit that behind the mask, she was simply human. So when we ask what may have caused her death, we must consider this. It was not only disease, not only poison, not only age. It was also the endless performance, the heavy crown, the suffocating makeup, and the cruel expectation of perfection. In the end, the theater of immortality killed its leading actress. As the final years pressed upon her, whispers of illness grew louder. Yet in the 16th century, diagnosis was less science, and more educated guesswork. Today, historians and physicians peer back through time, searching for clues in letters, diaries, and court reports. The puzzle is incomplete, but certain pieces shine with disturbing clarity. One culprit stands out: lead poisoning. Her beloved makeup, the thick white ceruse paste of vinegar and lead carbonate, clung to her face for decades. Her courtiers even noticed her skin growing thin, her hands trembling, her memory faltering. Symptoms all too familiar to modern medicine. Chronic exposure to lead causes fatigue, irritability, headaches, abdominal pain, and, eventually, death. Yet to her contemporaries, it was beauty itself. The price of looking eternal may have been her life. Others argue it was cancer. Throat cancer, perhaps, given her refusal to eat, her pain when swallowing, her hoarse voice. Or maybe blood poisoning, as some suggested when ulcers appeared on her skin. Pneumonia remains another theory. Cold, damp winters, combined with a weakened body, could easily have tipped her into a fatal infection. But beyond the medical guesses lies another truth. Elizabeth was old. 69 in an age when most women did not see 40. Her body carried the weight of decades, the stress of rule, the burden of constant vigilance, and the endless parade of performances she could never escape. Her physicians, though educated by the standards of their day, were limited. Remedies included bleeding, purging, and herbal concoctions that likely weakened her further. Imagine being bled when already frail, your body robbed of strength in the name of balance. We see a similar fate in other monarchs. Charles II of England, treated with nearly 50 different potions and procedures on his deathbed, died not only from illness but from the cures themselves. Catherine de' Medici's doctors, too, prescribed purges and powders that hastened her decline. In those centuries, the line between healing and harm was very thin. For Elizabeth, the greatest pain was not physical but symbolic. She had built her reign on resilience, on the appearance of strength. Yet in her final weeks, she could barely stand. She sat on cushions, silent, refusing food, refusing doctors, refusing even her bed. She lingered in her chamber, perched on the floor, as if sitting upright was the last thread holding her to the world. Sleep eluded her. Night after night, she remained awake, eyes wide, spirit restless, courtiers hovering in fear. They begged her to lie down. She refused. Perhaps she feared that if she closed her eyes, she would not open them again. In the end, her decline was less a single strike of disease, and more a slow unraveling. The lead on her skin, the years of strain, the infections untreated or mistreated, and the weight of age itself, all converged. What killed Elizabeth was not simply an illness. It was the very era she lived in. An age where beauty was toxic, medicine was misguided, and the crown was heavier than any mortal body could bear. Her death was not sudden, not dramatic. It was a long, drawn-out surrender, a queen who had defied time finally allowing time to claim her. And so England watched, as the Virgin Queen, who had stood unyielding for 44 years, slowly faded from the stage. When Elizabeth breathed her last, England held its breath with her. For 44 years, she had been the center of the realm. Every council decision, every foreign alliance, every hope and fear, wound itself around her. And now she was gone. The problem was simple, yet catastrophic. She had left no heir, no children, no direct bloodline to continue her fragile golden age. This was not new. Her counselors had begged her for decades to marry, to take a husband, to produce a child, to give England security. Yet she had refused. Again and again. To some, she declared herself married to her people. To others, she hinted at lost love, Robert Dudley, her lifelong companion. Perhaps she simply knew the dangers of marriage too well. Her own mother, Anne Boleyn, had been executed by a husband's decree. Her sister Mary's marriage to Philip of Spain had ended in disaster and foreign suspicion. Why would she risk the same? But her refusal meant England's future was uncertain. Who would rule now? The obvious candidate was James VI of Scotland, son of Mary, Queen of Scots. The same Mary whom Elizabeth had imprisoned and executed. Awkward family relations, to say the least. Yet James had one undeniable advantage: legitimacy. He was the great-great-grandson of Henry VII. His claim was strong, and more importantly, he was male. In a world still wary of female rulers, his gender gave him political weight. Still, the transition was far from guaranteed. England had seen bloody disputes of succession before, wars of the roses, rival cousins, endless conspiracies. Courtiers feared the same chaos would erupt again. Elizabeth herself had refused to name a successor publicly. Some say it was strategy, keeping rivals off balance. Others say it was pride. To name a successor was to admit she would one day die. But in her final hours, she is said to have whispered, almost reluctantly, the name of James. Perhaps it was not approval, but surrender. The news spread cautiously, from her chamber, to her privy council, to London's streets. The people wept, and yet, they also waited. Would this transition bring war, rebellion, foreign invasion? Instead, something remarkable happened. Silence. Calm. Acceptance. James was proclaimed king without bloodshed. No armies marched, no heads rolled, no factions tore the country apart. In that quiet succession, England avoided a nightmare. History could easily have turned another way. Imagine rival claimants tearing the land apart, France or Spain seizing the chance to invade, civil war breaking the fragile order. But instead, James entered London peacefully. The Tudor line ended, and the Stuart line began. This does not mean there was no unease. Whispers filled taverns. Could a Scottish king truly rule England? Would old resentments flare? Would Elizabeth's legacy vanish overnight? For many, her death marked not only the end of a reign but the end of an era. She had been the last Tudor. The flame that had lit England's golden age, of poets like Shakespeare, explorers like Drake, and victories like the defeat of the Spanish Armada. With her gone, that golden light dimmed, and what remained was uncertainty. Even her funeral carried this paradox. Mourners flooded London, draped in black, their cries echoing through the streets. Yet the crown moved on, swiftly, almost coldly, to James. Because monarchies do not pause for grief. The throne must always be filled, no matter how heavy the loss. And so, as England buried its virgin queen, it also looked north, to Scotland, to a king it barely knew. Elizabeth had ruled like a sun, her court orbiting her light. Now the sun had set, and no one knew what the new dawn would bring. The death of a monarch is always political. But with Elizabeth, it was also personal. Her subjects had never known another queen like her. She had outlived almost everyone of her generation, her rivals, her counselors, even her supposed heirs. For many, she had simply always been there, the great constant. When word of her passing reached London, bells tolled, black cloth draped shop fronts, citizens fell silent in the streets. Some cried openly, others whispered about omens. One story claims that on the morning she died, the great tree in Richmond Palace split in two. Another told of strange lights in the sky. Whether true or not, they reflected a mood that the world itself was grieving with England. The funeral was unlike any the city had seen before. Her coffin, draped in rich velvet, was carried on a grand hearse pulled by 4 horses. Figures of lions and dragons, symbols of England, guarded her along the way. A wax effigy of the Queen, dressed in her coronation robes, was placed atop the coffin. This figure stared out at the crowds as though Elizabeth herself were watching her own funeral procession. And the crowds were immense. Tens of thousands lined the streets. They crushed against each other for a glimpse of the cortege, some climbing rooftops just to watch their queen pass one final time. The poet John Stowe wrote that, the city mourned, as though it had lost a mother, and indeed, many thought of her that way. Stern at times, mysterious at others, but a figure of protection, stability, and identity. Her burial took place in Westminster Abbey, the resting place of monarchs. There, she was laid in a vault with her half-sister Mary. A curious pairing. Mary, the devout Catholic who had once persecuted Protestants, and Elizabeth, the Protestant queen who had executed Mary Queen of Scots. United in death, despite a lifetime of division. Yet in the days that followed, grief turned into myth-making. Pamphlets celebrated her as Gloriana, the eternal Virgin Queen. Portraits were copied and circulated, showing her eternally youthful, crowned, and radiant. In reality, her final years had been marked by frailty, tooth loss, and wigs to hide thinning hair. But the myth erased all weakness. She became timeless. A symbol, rather than a woman. Even Shakespeare's company, the Lord Chamberlain's men, felt the tremor of her passing. Their patronage shifted to King James. But the echoes of Elizabeth's reign lingered in plays, with queens who commanded with both charm and danger, with kings who rose and fell at the mercy of fate. Ordinary people, too, clung to memories. Ballads and broadsheets were sung in taverns, recounting her victories, her speeches, her defiance of Spain. She was our queen, they said. Not perfect, but theirs. And in a way, her legend grew greater in death than in life, because no successor could quite match her. James was scholarly, yes. Ambitious, certainly. But he lacked her charisma, her theater of power, her presence. This contrast only deepened the mourning. It was as though England had stepped from a golden age into something dimmer. Not tragic, not catastrophic, but quieter, more ordinary. The paradox of her death is that England wept for her, yet also accepted her end with remarkable calm. No rebellion, no violent struggle. Perhaps because her myth was already larger than life, her people could let her go, confident she would never truly disappear. And indeed, she hasn't. Centuries later, her name still glows in history. The Elizabethan age, an age of poets, explorers, and power. Even as her body turned to dust beneath Westminster, her legend lived on, polished by time. Mourning gave way to memory. Memory gave way to myth. And myth, at last, became immortality. With Elizabeth gone, the throne did not sit empty for long. James VI of Scotland, son of Mary, Queen of Scots, was proclaimed James I of England. It was, in some ways, the neatest possible solution. No bloodshed. No contested war of succession. England and Scotland, long enemies, now bound together by a single crown. A union in name, if not yet in law. Still, for the English, this shift felt strange. They had known nothing but Tudors for over a century. Henry VII, Henry VIII, Edward, Mary, Elizabeth. Now, suddenly, a Stuart sat on the throne. James was intelligent, fluent in Latin, French, even a little Italian. He fancied himself a scholar. He wrote treatises on kingship, witchcraft, even the dangers of tobacco. Yet, despite his cleverness, he lacked Elizabeth's theatrical instinct. Where she dazzled crowds with a glance, he shuffled awkwardly, tugging at his clothes. Where she inspired poets, he lectured like a schoolmaster. People noticed. In London, pamphleteers joked that England had traded a Queen of Hearts for a King of Scholars. His arrival in England was marked with pageantry, but also with whispers. Many recalled his mother, Mary, executed on Elizabeth's orders. Some wondered if her ghost might haunt the new king. Others worried he carried with him the shadows of Scottish politics, feuds, clans, conspiracies. James himself carried other anxieties. He feared assassination, a fear not unfounded, given the gunpowder plot that would soon shake his reign. He traveled with heavy guards, and he preferred the company of trusted courtiers to mingling with his subjects. Elizabeth had projected the illusion of being everyone's queen. James, by contrast, seemed closed off, almost foreign. And yet, England adjusted. Because ordinary life has a way of continuing, no matter who wears the crown. Merchants still opened their shops at dawn. Apprentices still hurried through muddy streets. Farmers still brought produce into the city. The monarchy changed, but bread had to be baked, cloth had to be sold, ships had to be sailed. In court, though, the shift was obvious. Elizabeth's carefully balanced circle of advisers gave way to James's favorites. Men like Robert Carr, and later George Villiers, who dazzled the king with youth, beauty, and loyalty. To many, these close attachments looked suspiciously like indulgence. And court gossip spread quickly. The elegance of Elizabeth's reign, her silken masks, her golden progressions, gave way to something looser, less polished. Banquets grew louder, hunting parties longer. The court became more of a family gathering than a theater of majesty. Poets noticed, too. Where Edmund Spenser had once celebrated Elizabeth as a fairy queen, the great writers of James's reign, like Shakespeare, shifted their tone. Darker plays appeared. Macbeth with its witches. King Lear with its crumbling kingdoms. Tragedy suited the mood of transition. And while England admired its new monarch, many still compared him, often unfavorably, to the queen who had just left the stage. Perhaps that is the cruel truth of succession. The glow of the predecessor makes the successor look pale, no matter his merits. Still, James did something remarkable without even trying. He unified two crowns. He laid the foundation for the United Kingdom, even if the process would take another century. But to those alive at the time, it felt less like a triumph, and more like the end of an era. The Virgin Queen was gone. the Tudor flame had flickered out. And with James, England had stepped into a new world. A world where memory of Elizabeth loomed larger than her successor's living presence. And yet, history, like the tide, moved forward. Elizabeth died in 1603. Yet in many ways, she never left. Her presence lingered, not only in the monuments carved in stone, but in the stories people told. To her subjects, she became something larger than life. A golden age embodied in a single woman. The queen who defied Spain. The queen who ruled without a husband. The queen who, by sheer willpower, had kept England whole. But history, as always, is more complicated. Beneath the shining image lay contradictions. She ruled with grace, and with ruthlessness. She inspired loyalty, and fear. She lifted England's prestige, yet left the kingdom financially strained. Her death itself became part of the mythology. The old queen, refusing food, wasting away in silence. The physicians helpless. Courtiers whispering in the shadows. And in her final gesture, refusing to be crowned again, even in death, she left behind the mystery of what truly ended her. Was it blood poisoning, pneumonia, cancer, or simply the exhaustion of carrying a crown for 44 years? No one could say. And in that uncertainty, legend found room to grow. Poets turned her into a symbol. For some, she was Gloriana, a near immortal, beyond the flaws of mortal flesh. For others, she was the tragic maiden queen, sacrificing love for duty. The truth, as always, sat somewhere in between. Ordinary people remembered her differently. In the countryside, old men told grandchildren how they had once cheered her procession. In London, merchants recalled how business had thrived during her wars. And sailors remembered the defeat of the Armada, with her voice echoing across the centuries, "I have the heart and stomach of a king." The irony, of course, is that in life she often feared how she would be remembered. She micromanaged her portraits, banning artists who dared depict her wrinkles. She wrapped herself in symbols, pearls for chastity, suns for majesty, roses for England. As if by controlling the image, she could control posterity. And in a way, she succeeded. To this day, when we picture Elizabeth, we do not see the weary woman of her last days. We see the glittering figure in ruffs and jewels, radiant and untouchable. She curated her immortality. And it worked. Her reign became a yardstick. Centuries later, Victorians looked back and called it a golden age. Filmmakers cast her as fierce and brilliant. Schoolbooks softened her edges. She became less a woman, and more an idea. But if you strip away the layers of legend, you find something more human. A woman who laughed, who raged, who felt loneliness keenly. A ruler who balanced on a knife's edge of diplomacy, strategy, and sheer performance. And a queen whose end, however it came, reminds us that even the greatest must yield to time. Perhaps that is why she fascinates us still. Because in her story, we see both the fragility of flesh, and the possibility of transcending it. So tonight, as we close the book on Elizabeth's life, imagine her not as marble, not as myth, but as a tired woman, sitting in her chamber, aware the end was near. A woman who had outlived her friends, her rivals, even her youth. A queen who gave everything to the crown, and in the quiet of her final hours, slipped into legend. And with that, the Tudor age drew its last breath. And history, once more, turned the page.